Donc, nous allons maintenant faire place à Monsieur Marek McGann, qui est maître de conférences au département de psychologie, Mary McLeod College, en Limerick, Irlande. Il co-coordonne les ENSO Seminars de Enactive Seminars Online, une série qui est déjà dans la 5e année d'activité, si je ne me trompe pas. Et les titres de la conférence, Wayfaring, Entangled Bodies. Bon, j'invite alors M. McGann à parler et à partager votre écran, s'il vous plaît. La parole est à vous.
Thank you. And as Monty Python have already been quoted as saying, now for something completely different. There will be a dramatic shift in direction and focus as we move into the next few minutes. But I want to say thank you very much to the organizers. It has been a joy to be involved in the kind of sustained level of intellectual discussion that we have seen over the past few days. And it's been a long time since I was involved in the same. In my home, we have got to the point where we can communicate simply with grunts and gestures. And so my apologies and also my thanks to the interpreters for the next few minutes. So what I will be looking at is the way in which the notion of the body plays a role in enactive thinking, and the ways in which that has also changed over since the initial developments of the enactivism in the early 1990s, but also that there is continuity in it too. So the enactive approach has always been an embodied approach to cognitive science. It's right there in the title. It was right there at the start. And from the beginning, the emphasis has been on the ways in which the body plays a constitutive and crucial role in the way the mind works and in cognition. But also from the get-go, we have had this question of what is a body precisely. Very quickly in most of the discussions about embodiment and inaction, when the body is raised, it is immediately put into interaction with its environment. And the emphasis in the discussion often quickly shifts to that interaction, with the body having a sort of a dynamic or energizing role. But precisely what we mean when we say embodied, other than this sort of physical movement gets involved, is sometimes not very clear. And how bodies have been conceptualized both implicitly and explicitly, as I've said, has changed as the enactive approach has developed. Though I would also note that while our conceptualization of embodiment has changed and been refined, it's also true that the conclusions that arise from it, from this sort of embodied perspective, have largely remained the same, or at least have been there in seed form right from the beginning as well. So as we have refined our conceptualization of the body, so it has in large part been involved in providing better and more appropriate support to the kinds of the conclusions that enactive researchers are interested in doing, or interested in sort of reaching. So what is sort of what the rest of the talk will be is essentially me unpacking some of the recent discussion about the body within the enactive literature, and focusing principally on work by Ezequiel de Paulo and various colleagues, and sort of unpacking what I think are some of the implications of that shift, which, as we'll see, will just involve a sort of a shift in perspective or a shift in emphasis, rather than a dramatic transformation of the implications of enactive thinking. But what I have also realized recently on the back of work by Nick Brancaccio, Hannah Diacher, and others, is that these developments in thinking about the body have brought inactive thinking into deeper accord with what are actually long-standing viewpoints within feminist philosophy. That is, within feminist philosophy of science, within certain aspects of sociopolitics and sociology and so on. And so I want to, having sort of been introduced to this perspective, as I sort of mentioned, following Nick Brancaccio, Hannah, and also sort of present in, you know, sometimes implicitly, sometimes explicitly in Ezekiel Di Paolo's, Elena Cufari, and Hannah Yeager's book, Linguistic Bodies. There is a kind of a coming into resonance of the enactive theory with these feminist viewpoints. And having been introduced to it by their work, I have begun to explore it in more depth. And as Sebastian earlier asked for a certain amount of patience, that in essence this is relatively young work in progress. I am to a large extent a student in this area rather than certainly not a teacher of it. So I would also welcome feedback, suggestions, and pointers in terms of the implications and in terms of other potential points of resonances. So my principal aim here is to share my enthusiasm about these kinds of resonance, about the opportunities that exist in finding richer resources for thinking about the body and how the body interacts with the environment from these feminist literatures. And I know perhaps you were hoping for something a little bit more than Marek's enthusiasm, but it's been the end of a long year, and enthusiasm is the most I'll have to offer for the moment. But I think there will sort of real opportunities for productive alliances and richer discussions as we move forward. So we might begin with a paper or book chapter from 2018 by Ezekiel Di Paolo called The Enactive Conception of Life. And we might think of it, or sort of recharacterize that, in fact, of beyond autopoiesis. In this chapter, Ezekiel takes a good bit of time to distinguish the enactive approach from, as he calls it, the classical autopoiesis definition of living systems. I imagine at this point with this audience, there is no need to offer sort of detailed descriptions. We're fully familiar with the closed circle diagram, and we're fully familiar with the idea of autopoiesis as a network of processes of production that form a unity, that it in turn, that unity provides the basis for the continued existence of that network. But as Ezekiel notes, initially in the embodied mind, autopoiesis gets essentially no mention at all. It was only in subsequent work and contextual work by Varela that the concepts of autopoiesis, not the concepts of autopoiesis specifically, became refined and integrated into enactive thinking, and particularly in through the inclusion of a paper by Andreas Weber and Varela from 2002. The reason essentially is that while the logic of autonomous systems and organizational closure is quite broad and general, autopoiesis in its formulation is really very specific. And it sort of offers us a fairly limited conception of what the body is and how the body of a cognitive system might work. So what I find what's interesting is that in this 2018 book chapter, the title of the chapter is The Enactive Conception of Life. But the question that Di Paolo is essentially addressing in the chapter is, what is a body? And that gives us this sense that what is a body for the enactive approach is that which is a living system. And autopoiesis as a ground or a foundation for the concept of what constitutes a living system is very specific and limited in its way. As Ezekiel points out, the autonomy grounds value, but autopoiesis essentially only enables a binary value. And that is either the conservation or the dissolution of the autopoietic organization. As far as an autopoietic system is concerned, so long as it continues to maintain its organizational closure, any other change really isn't sort of experienced or responded to. It simply is either the circle remains closed or it doesn't. So we have these sort of two possibilities as such. In an earlier paper in 2005, Diplo introduced an argument for the requirement of adaptivity in addition to autonomy, so autopoiesis being autonomy in the chemical domain. And what adaptivity does, it allows the system to regulate its interactions with the environment. And this regulation of the interaction, all of a sudden, rather than simply distinguishing itself as separate from its environment and then, you know, as a minimal living system, either being alive or being dead, an adaptive autonomous system is capable of regulating its interactions with the environment in order to maintain itself as a living system. And so, you know, in blunt terms, a purely autopoietic system, the only action an actual sort of purely classically autopoietic system can do is to die. That's essentially the one change it is capable of. But adaptive autonomous systems become capable of a wide range of different interactions with their environment. And so the organizational closure, the autonomy or self-individuation that plays an important role in defining itself as a system, so long as that is maintained, that provides the ground for the sort of valuing of the environment as either positive and negative, as dangerous, or as being full of opportunity. It's with adaptivity that you get that kind of richer potential for interaction. With a more complex body, you get a more complex set of potential interactions with the environment. But a living system, the enactive conception of life, is then caught in this constant play. On the one hand, it is the closure of the system as a self-individuating system that differentiates or distinguishes itself from its world, that creates the identity of the system, that gives us our sort of basis for value. But on the other, there's the requirement to be continually changing in response to what is happening in the world. So the adaptively autonomous system, as Ezekiel points out, argues that adaptivity implies that living beings are caught between these irreconcilable tendencies we have on the left and right here in the diagram, between something that is closed and rigidly fixed and essentially cannot perform any actions, to one that is open and flows and goes with the world, but then loses its identity. And the enactive conception of life, as he puts it, is one that moves and changes over time in order to maintain some kind of balance between, as he puts it, a primordial tension. This primordial tension between isolation through self-distinction on the one hand, and dissolution through just being dissolved in the environment and indistinguishable from the environment on the other. So life is defined by its struggle to maintain itself between these two poles. And the body is therefore defined as the adaptive system that interacts with its environment in this way. What's particularly interesting about this sort of shift from the classical autopoiesis to the enactive conception of life, as Diplo outlines it, is, and Diplo doesn't put it in these terms, but I think it's implicit in the way that the argument unfolds, is that there is a shift here between talking about values of conservation to talking about values of continuity. And I think there's a kind of a roll-on implication from that that we can see is present in, again, much of the enactive literature. I think it's present even in the earliest writings on enaction, but is frequently lost when we go to talk about the bodies, because as soon as we start talking about bodies in their definitions, we tend to run to autopoiesis and to quite abstract or closed conceptions of bodies as bodies rather than as basis for cognition. So I want to draw or refer to a work by the anthropologist Tim Ingold in his book Being Alive. He explicitly draws attention to these two different ways of conceiving of an organism, or we might think of it as conceiving as of a body, a valued body. On the one hand, on the left here, we have the traditional diagram for autopoiesis, in which the emphasis is on the self-distinction and the individuation, the body closed in on itself. On the other, we have a wandering line. They are both lines drawn with arrows at the end of it, but on the right-hand side here, we have a body that's wandering through the world or progressing through the world rather than distinct from it. And I think the enactive conception of life, as Diplo argued for it in that 2018 book chapter, and as has become more clear in subsequent works, is something actually a little bit closer to this wandering arrow on the right. And this sort of, as I said, we have this distinction between the closed system, or the opening and moving through the world, and this change in value, which is already on the heading, from valuing the conservation of the organizational closure to the continuity of the living system. Right, so that's a shift from maintaining something in a rather static way to keeping going. And given, if we're talking about adaptive autonomous systems, then the point of the adaptive autonomous system, as Diplo put it, is to maintain some kind of dialectical balance between these opposing tendencies and this, as he called it, sort of primordial tension. But interestingly, while we talk we sort of frequently talk of autopoiesis as grounding value, or sometimes even naturalizing value, if people get very excited. If we think instead, again, it's sort of shifting our emphasis rather than completely saying, one is wrong and one is right, but rather trying to keep both in our field of view. We might shift from talking about the body as a locus of value to a nexus of transformation. The point of the enactive conception of life, of adaptive autonomy, trying to maintain the progress of the organism through the world, means that maintaining the organism itself, maintaining the biology or the organic stuff, becomes less vital. That will constantly change. And again, no one activist would deny it, that there was always been an awareness of development, an emphasis on responsiveness and interaction with the environment. But what that tells us about how we should conceive of the body and the body's role in things, I think, doesn't get unpacked in this way, in quite the same way. So rather than thinking about a boundary as separating the organism from the world, we might think about the body as something which basically churns the world, that moves the world around us and moves us through the world by transforming the world from something that isn't us into something that is. That's sort of explicitly the case in terms of metabolism, but is also more generally and abstractly the case in terms of sense making. We sort of take something, we interact with the world or face the world in a way that doesn't make sense, and act in ordered ways to make it make sense, as to incorporate what's happening in the world into our ongoing activities and identities. And so the body is less about separating the agent from the world than it is about this ongoing continuity of transformation. And what that means is, again, it's a shift in emphasis. These are themes that are always present in the enactive literature. Bodies as distinguishing boundaries we're very explicit about very frequently, but bodies as transformative tangles, where the boundaries are not necessarily the be-all and end-all. They're not the only thing that matters. We're not always looking to maintain the boundaries, because the boundaries are going to be flexible and adaptive and changing as we learn and develop. But what will be important is all of the different things, the threads of the world that are impacting upon us, get woven into something that makes sense through our bodily activities. And so the body's process, the body's purpose or essence as such, is this kind of enacted tangle. And this, I think, as well, it was there in the earliest enactive writings in principle, and indeed in the prehistory of the enactive approach. So on Mondays, Sebastian quoted Brady as discussing bodies in precisely this way, as these transformative processes of sort of churning through the world, rather than as these isolated, distinct entities. When you break open the organism and push it out into the world, so as we are paying attention to its progress through the world, rather than its sort of isolation as an identity, we kind of notice certain things about the diagrams. The environment isn't here all that much. For all the discussion of codependent arising, the environment tends to be the blank space around the organism or the agent or the system, rather than having, this is probably as exciting as the environment gets in a lot of the enactive diagrams. It's a wavy line. That wavy line represents all of the complexity and richness of the environment, but we'll note that it is also held at arrow's length from the organism itself in these classical diagrams. And so enactivists have not been great on our theorizing of the environment, and I think I've seen a few of them admit it, at least. Again, sort of not to say Diplo is the only one who speaks on these issues, but there's a 2016 paper in which he is commenting on criticisms by ecological psychologists, Fulto, Ni, and Corello, in which Diplo says, well, look, we just haven't got to it yet, essentially. We'll get there, but we needed to get a lot of this grounding aspects sorted out first. And let's also, let's not make too much of it, because while the bodies are schematized, there's not an awful lot to the body in these diagrams either. I think most bodies are more interestingly rich than circles with arrows on them too. But I think that's really part of the point. A lot of the standard view within enactive theorizing is that organisms encounter their environments as landscapes of concern. Again, we do not encounter the environment neutrally, as we've already noted. We are autonomous systems in adaptive interaction with our environment. The aspects of the world that are relevant and they're relevant to us and that impinge upon the bodies we are those aspects of the world to which we are sensitive and with which we are capable of acting. And so the environments we encounter, the world that is brought forth for us, is one that says, turn left or right. Again, the classic cartoon example here is a bacterium encountering a sugar gradient, and the bacterium orienting itself on the sugar gradient according to its metabolism, to move in the direction that has more food. And essentially, in any circumstances in which we are acting, we might have we exist in a world that is a complex of such variants. If I want a drink, then I need more left than right at present, because my drink, well, it's off. It's probably to the right of your screen now, but it's my left. Such are the characteristics of all of our encounters with the environment. Those encounters are valued all the way down. But the net result is that adaptively autonomous systems don't just animate the organism, they animate the world. They create gradients in a world that didn't have them. But particularly again, when we think of the body as a nexus of transformation, the body transforms the universe into a thing with direction, with value. And it's not something that is confined or enclosed or captured and trapped by the body, but rather that only comes into existence around the body and through the body. So we can imagine here this simple fluid dynamics animation as a body moving forward through an environment, but the world itself has a current or a flow, and you can move back and forth between saying, well, this is an agent moving forward in a static environment, or flow moving past an agent. But once you've got the churn of metabolism and need and care and pressure and influence, then you have not just a body, but a concerned world too. And bodies are complex. And here I can simply say what Sebastian said. I'm going to do a really brief and blunt and cartoonish version of some of the points that Sebastian raised earlier on. And I'll do it just in reference to the enactive literature per se, but Sebastian did a beautiful job of exploring basically how this basic idea connects with the philosophy of biology that has sort of a long history prior to something like the embodied mind. But our autonomy-based descriptions of bodies emphasize unities. These circles, they're usually just one of them drawn, and the autonomous system is a coherent system that constitutes an identity. But enactive researchers have always also held views on the complexity of bodies. So I will reference now Thompson and Varela from 2001, but also there's evidence and reference to it explicitly in Varela's earlier work in 1991 and 1997, where we're not just talking about a single body, but rather a collection of intertangled bodies. So in the 2001 paper, Thompson and Varela talk about the difference between the organic body, the sensory motor body, and intersubjective, though now influenced by the Diplo et al. Book, we might talk about them as linguistic bodies, although the intersubjective body is much broader than the linguistic body too. But we might also talk about the phenomenological body. And these are all essentially happening at the same time. So these are, we might have drawn these as nested circles, but just like Sebastian said earlier today, in fact, these bodies are not concentric, they are eccentric. The sensory motor body is fundamentally tied to the organic. I cannot perform actions of which my body is incapable, but my skills and capabilities and habits are much more incorporated by worldly loops of action than they are just by the organic. And of course, under certain circumstances, there will be times when my intersubjective body or my sensory motor body might drag my organic body away from its center. If one of my children, if the life of one of my children was threatened, then my intersubjective world might drag my organic body into a position of lethal, fatal danger in order to try and protect or take my child out of danger. And we can say the same for zealots or just soldiers or firefighters. any number of different groups of people for whom their intersubjective and sensory motor bodies are not coextensive and certainly not concentric with the organic body. And the autonomous systems then, because they are engaged with the world, they are not coextensive with the organic body, but sort of reach out into the world and are captured by things that are already happening in the world. Adaptive systems basically essentially make the whole process messy. Now, I can use the word messy in its sort of simple intuitive sense, but also in the more theoretical sense that Elena Cufari, I think, and Ezekiel Capello and Hannah Teher introduced in their book. So recent enactive work has explicitly examined just how these complexities of the body affect our understanding of mental phenomena. And in particular, what I want to highlight is that what they emphasize is our worlds are complex too. Complex bodies and so they animate environments, and animate environments change our conceptions of what action are. So instead of just maintaining the metabolic or organic aspects of the living system, there are sensory motor and social aspects. And again, these are all implicit. They've been there from the beginning in the enactive approach. But I think, again, this hooking of the body into the environment might have been not emphasized to the extent that it should, particularly the way that the environment becomes animated. The environment is reaching into us just as much as we are reaching into it. Actions, rather than coming out of the agent, are frequently a matter of the agent joining in with things that are already happening in the environment. Bodies are made up of not a single closed identity, but or even just a single organizationally closed system, but several of them tangled up together. We might think of the nervous system, right? The central nervous system is the obvious place that a lot of people go, but the central nervous system is hooked into the metabolic system and the musculoskeletal and the immune system, and all of these things are all closed systems, but they're also tangled up with one another, and they're also tangled up with the world. So just where you draw the circle gets a bit difficult. What's more interesting, I guess, is the way that this tangle moves through the environment. But the environment itself is animated. It's full of other agents, and also it's full of our concerns. And so actions are not just movements coming out of our body into the world, but rather us sort of bringing our activity into coordination and resonance with the world at multiple scales of activity. It's actually quite difficult to diagram, but a rich source of metaphor and analogy here I find to be the weather. If you want to explain any individual measurement or observation about the weather, well, you can say, well, it's just, there was this much sun, or there was this much rain, or there was this much wind. But in fact, a full understanding of the weather means thinking about the season, or the ebb and flow of tides over the course of hours, and the movement of clouds over the course of minutes, and the changes in sunlight over the course of a 24-hour period. And essentially a better way of starting to think about action is not just measuring at one time scale, but rather seeing how the actions or activities you're interested in coordinate with things that are already going on at these other bigger timescales. If you want to paddle a boat across the sea and you haven't taken account of the tide, then your paddling probably isn't going to go very well. And the same is true of if you want to give a talk at a conference, but you haven't paid too much attention to the timetable of the conference, the length of time of the talks, and a host of other aspects of just professional movements and professional ebbs and flows. So both our continuity as bodies and our potency as agents depends on this process of effectively joining in with the world, with an animated sort of energized world, as much as it does the production of specific activities. And when we think of the body as a nexus of transformation involved in adaptively regulating our environment, or adaptively regulating its engagement with these existing flows, we start to get a sense of the body, again, not as this sort of simple thing that is produced by just a particular closed set of self-distinguishing processes of production, but rather something which is in a complex process of regulating itself in relation to the environment. I think this is, I mean, it's a difficult book to read, but the Diplo et al.'s Linguistic Bodies is an attempt to unpack this process for the whole domain of the intersubjective, looking at how we arise as agents not just by sprouting forth from the collection of cells and neurons and muscles and movements we're capable of, but arrive in communities that already exist with flows of pressure and influence that already exist. And coming to be a linguistic being means joining in with these systems and flows of activity that already work. So bodies are where these various dynamic scales and domains get tangled up, these nexuses of transformation. And that makes bodies a lot more abstract than the biology would have us believe. And certainly it would suggest that our closed cell, that is our sort of go-to diagram or conceptualization of a body interacting with the world, is perhaps not the most effective and evocative one. Messy bodies make messy environments, and indeed messy environments make messy bodies. Again, I think this is probably just to a large extent a rougher and messier version of what Sebastian was talking about earlier. But I think what is interesting and exciting is the ways in which this transformation of the way we think about bodies resonates with work on bodies that was already happening in the 1980s, being undertaken by feminist scholars, famously by Haraway, but also by Harding, and later by Butler and Karen Barad, amongst many others. So there's Haraway's famous discussion of the manifestos for a cyborg, in which she points out that the body must be understood as this tangled mess of technological, biological, political, and other factors. Means that we need to shift away and retrain our intuitions and learn to engage with our agency in a way that tries to sort of not necessarily tease all these things apart and separate them, because they cannot be fully separated, but at least to recognize, acknowledge, and appreciate the ways in which they are entangled with one another. And these feminist perspectives offer us the sort of theoretical and philosophical resources to examine bodies as confluence of influence, pressure, and care. And I think the resonance with enactive work is something that is apparent even from the kinds of talks that we saw last night. So bodies, as I said, I've already covered, the bodies are biological, technological, they're personal, they're professional, they're socio-political, and they're historical. I just want to give one quick example of some of this work that I find particularly intriguing, and that is Karen Barad's work on the whole process of measurement and observation. Barad is inspired by and builds on the physics work of Niels Bohr. I mentioned Barad on Monday when we had the wonderful lecture by Michel Bitbol, but it's sort of this quotation is a beautiful one, which I think makes very clear just how inactive Barad is, despite the fact that they have never really directly engaged with the enactive literature. They're coming to this way of thinking from the physics and from Bohr, rather than from the likes of Varela, Thomson, or even others associated. So we do not uncover pre-existing facts about independently existing things as they exist frozen in time, like little statues positioned in the world. Rather, we learn about phenomena, about specific material configuration of the world's becoming. So it's, again, the characteristic that's present in the kinds of philosophy of biology that Sebastian has discussed so eloquently, but also is implied by the co-arising of agent and environment. Just as the agent is continually becoming, so the world is continually becoming. It's not a static thing waiting for us to interact with it, but rather an indeterminate thing which gets transformed by our actions. So to continue the quote, the point is not simply to put the observer or knower back in the world, as if the world were a container and we needed merely to acknowledge our situatedness in it, but to understand and take account of the fact that we too are part of the world's differential becoming. This is an animate, energized world that matters a great deal. But Barad is also making the very interesting point that if your physics does not produce observers, then your physics is manifestly wrong, because the only thing we know for certain is there are observers. And Barad provides a whole range of theoretical and philosophical resources in order to try to unpick this really intimate relationship. So they explore the depth, in-depth, the scientific process of making observations and measurements. And there's a lovely quotation: apparatuses are boundary-making practices. So the experimental apparatus of a physics experiment is an apparatus for drawing a distinction between an agent and the world. That is the purpose of an apparatus, is to make this boundary. And the way in which you organize the apparatus will create the boundary in different ways. I use the illustration here simply as if we think of, if we look of I find the analogy of painting can be quite useful. That some of the picture is drawn with very broad strokes, and that gives us the broad outline, but it has a different tool associated with it, a wider brush and simpler movements. And some of it is done with fine strokes with a finer brush. There's a nice animation of a sort of a time lapse of this drawing in particular, in fact, which I'll show you at the end, but the video didn't work very well for me. So, but each of these tools and each of the implements allows us to make certain kinds of distinctions. But the distinctions are specific to the tools, and as you change, as you do different, you make different distinctions. So the way you perceive the thing changes too. So as the finer brushstrokes get done over the broader ones, the broader brushstrokes get kind of brushed away and changed by the constant interaction with the process of painting. So Barad's work provides some resources for unpicking, or as they put it, diffracting the array of dynamics involved in scientific practice around agent-environment interactions. So I'll just go into just a little bit more detail. Oh, this slide has appeared all at once. It has thrown itself out and fully formed into the world. But this is partly in response to Michelle's talk on Monday, in which he warned that Barad was too keenly focused on being a realist. And I think what's interesting is Barad actually is a very enactive kind of realism. The quotation here, in which he points out that the process of producing even Einstein's theory of relativity involved a lot more than just trying to identify something real about the universe. Social, technological, and scientific practices that included the entangled apparatuses of colonial conquest, democracy, world citizenship, anti-anarchism, trains, telegraphs, clocks, and other electromechanical devices composed of wires and gears, all played a role in the production of the special theory of relativity. And this is a vital aspect to Barad's work. What Barad considers to be an apparatus is the entire organization that produces the observation of measurement, not just the equipment in the laboratory, which is how Niels Bohr, their inspiration, wants to talk about apparatuses. It's not just well, let's find out what's in the world, but rather how do all of these larger and smaller processes of transformation and flows in the environment come together in a confluence that produces the observation at the end. Each measurement or observation introduces an agential cut, delineating agent and environment in the same process. And crucially, they point out that when this is done, so their domain is in the realm of quantum physics, where of course we all know of this famous uncertainty principle. But for Bohr and for Barad, the universe was not uncertain, it was indeterminate. It's not that there was a real answer that we just couldn't get to, it's that there is genuinely no answer before the measurement gets made. And that the universe remains indeterminate until we build some apparatus which creates this agential cut and essentially instantiates both an agent and a universe at the same time. Okay, so where does this leave us? It leaves us with my animations going all awry, as it turns out, but we shall survive this. I'm just coming to a close. Enactive researchers have always been sensitive to the collective aspects of agency and embodiment. Again, while we so frequently talk about embodiment as the thing which differentiates us and separates us from the world, again, even from the get-go, implicitly, there has been an awareness that we live in a shared world and we live in a world in which we are interacting with others. And this collectivity is identified even by Diplo in that 2018 book chapter on the enactive conception of life. But I think through this recent work, expanding and elucidating these aspects of the complex body, engaged with an animate and powerful world and an environment that it has rich dynamics which play a role in our dynamics, brings forward this sort of ideas of engagement with the world at multiple levels that is very resonant with feminist thinking. So if we imagine this red circle in the center here as, well, that's the observation we want to make, that's the thing we want to try to understand, but at any given moment, well, what we'll our process of observation will do is pick out a number of different influences that have come together in that moment, seeing their correspondence with one another, but also be able to see how they affect one another, but also continue on and do their own thing too. They have a history prior to that moment of observation, and the moment of observation or the action that gets taken will affect that history, but it won't define it or specify it completely. So engagement with the rich work of these feminist scholars invites us to diffract bodies that sort of break them apart or see how they, the number of different aspects of them that are involved or entangled together, and to explore the complexities of wayfaring bodies that are progressing through the world, but also tangled up with the world. And so I think the future holds great opportunities for richer work from a diverse range of voices within Enaction, and is certainly something I'm very much looking forward to. So I will stop taking up your time. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.